The Fire Within by Chris DeLacy. We are now on page 236, Oh Sophie. It was a Saturday afternoon before Sophie called. 4 long days since the journey to the hospital. David was sprawled out on his bed, editing a chapter of Snigger and the Nut Beast, when the telephone rang in the living room. Just a moment, I'll call him. He heard Liz answer. David, Sophie for you. David practically fell off the bed. He snatched up a comb, tidied his hair, realized how utterly pointless that was, and headed for the phone, only to find that Lucy had beaten him to it. It's me, Lucy. Is Conker all right? Thank you. Liz yanked the phone from her grasp. Sorry, she apologized to Sophie. There seems to be some strange interference on the line. Here's David now. Lucy stamped her foot. Liz bustled her into the hall. Out. Sophie wants to talk to David in private. Why can't I talk to her? Because you're not a handsome young man? Well, neither is he. Kitchen, said Liz. And that was that. As it happened, David was off the phone in less than 2 shakes of a squirrel's tail. That was quick, said Liz, as he joined them at the table. What's the news on Conker? I'm not sure, said David, looking perplexed. Sophie didn't want to say on the phone. She's coming by in 20 minutes. Goodness, said Liz. Plates, Lucy. Huh? Went Lucy in a toady voice. David's girlfriend is coming to lunch? There was fruitcake and an egg custard and a lemon meringue pie and pyramids of tuna and cucumber sandwiches. When David saw the size of the spread, he made a mental note to invite Sophie over as often as he could. Sophie herself seemed quite astonished that Liz had gone to so much trouble. Nonsense, said Liz. Come on, dig in. David, why don't you get Sophie a drink? David moved to the counter. What would you like? Something herbal would be nice. Top cabinet, said Liz. There's a range of flavors. David found them. He chose a rosehip tea bag and dropped it in a mug. Is Conker all right now? Lucy chipped in. It was the 3rd time she'd asked since Sophie had arrived. Sophie sat forward and pushed a grain of salt across the table. I'm afraid I've got good news and bad news about Conker. Oh dear, said Liz, feeding Bonington some tuna. David winced. The electric kettle clicked off. Bad news? Lucy's bottom lip started to quiver. Sophie reached over and touched her hand. Let me tell you the good news first. Conker's eye isn't nearly as bad as it looks. When Mr. Deans examined him, he opened the wound and scraped out a lot of hardened pus. That sounds painful, Liz said, squirming. Better out than in, said Sophie. The wound had swollen because of the infection, and that was why his eye was closed. But when Mr. Deans examined the eye fully, it reacted to a beam of light. So Conker isn't blind on that side? Said David. No, said Sophie, taking a sandwich. On Tuesday, Mr. Deans put 2 small stitches over the cut and gave Conker some antibiotics to prevent any more infections from developing. It healed very quickly. Wounds like that often do. David nodded and put her tea on the table. So if that was the good news, what's the bad? Sophie crossed her legs and twiddled a silver ring on her finger. Her voice dropped to a gentle murmur. The rest has to do with the twitching you saw. Mr. Deans took a sample of Conker's blood and ran some tests on it. We had to wait for the results. That's why it took so long to get back to you. David slipped into the chair beside Lucy's. Lucy had suddenly gotten very quiet. Sophie looked at everyone in turn. Conker has kidney failure, she whispered. David stared at her for several seconds. You mean he's going to die? Yes. Lucy immediately fell against her mother. David looked away briefly, reached for a sandwich, and then changed his mind. How long does he have? That's difficult to tell, Sophie said gently, looking sympathetically at Lucy. There's no real way of knowing. Mr. Dean says he might live a long time. Then again, he might not. He can't die, wailed Lucy. Conker can't die. David gulped and rubbed a hand across his mouth. I know it's sad, Sophie continued, but try to think of it like this. If it hadn't been for you, Conker might not be alive today. You've given him the chance to live a lot longer. He's bouncing around very happily right now. Lucy sniffed and wiped her eyes. Can he go to the library gardens? Sophie smiled and cradled her tea in her hands. Rosehip with milk. How unusual, she said. She braced herself and took a quick sip. Well, that brings me to the other news. David threw her a worried look. There was something else that Mr. Dean said. I didn't know before, but it seems gray squirrels are classed as pests. Lucy's mouth fell open in shock. Who said that? Was it Mr. Bacon? Lucy, shush. Liz soothed her. What are you saying? David asked bluntly. Sophie took a breath and came to the point. By law, if you catch a gray squirrel, you're not supposed to return it to the wild. What? The pyramid of tuna sandwiches collapsed as David jarred a knee against the tabletop. Liz frowned at him and popped a few back onto the plate. You mean Conker can't leave the hospital, Sophie? No, Lucy shouted. Conker wants to go to the library gardens. And what about Snigger? David rapped. You can't keep him locked up. Sophie fidgeted in her seat. She coughed and tugged at the hem of her skirt. I thought you'd feel like this, she said slowly, which makes what I have to say more bearable, I hope. The kitchen fell deathly quiet. Sophie stuck her chin in the air. Some species of wild animals are very hard to keep. They gnaw at their cages or burrow in the earth. We have to be watchful or they find a way out. Find a way out? There was rising anger in David now. Are you telling us Snigger escaped? Asked Liz. Sophie pushed her hands between her thighs. Oh no, I don't believe that, David shouted. He thumped the table and rose to his feet. I told you to watch him. I told you he was tricky. Lucy grasped a thread of hope and said, He's going back to the gardens, Mom. He'll need a really good map if he is, said Liz. It took me ages to find the hospital. She glared at David as he paced the kitchen. We've got to do something quickly, he fretted. He'll head across country, staying close to woodland, probably guided by the sun's position. David, please. I haven't finished. Sophie tightened her lip. They did get out. What, both of them? Yes, through a hole in the fence. David threw up his hands in horror. I'll get my coat. We've got to start looking for them right away. That was enough for Sophie. Oh, David, sit down. The tenant stumbled back as if he couldn't quite believe the force of the reprimand. Even Liz raised a rather surprised or possibly impressed eyebrow. David took his heel out of Bonington's food dish and sat. Sophie pinned him with a steady stare. Like I said, they did get out, but they didn't get far. I made sure of that. How? Asked Lucy. Sophie bit into a sandwich and chewed it fast. I was waiting for them on the other side. David cocked his head. Waiting? How? Just waiting, David, with a small cat carrier. Lucy looked open-mouthed at her mom. Oh, Sophie, sighed Liz, figuring out what she did. Sophie's cheek turned a delicate shade of red. You mean you caught them? Lucy asked. Yes, said Sophie, sipping her tea. David's face went through a sea of expressions. He finally settled on calm but intrigued. Where is this carrier? In the back of my car. Yes, squealed Lucy, launching into Sophie-sized hug. Gosh, said David, partly in shock, partly in admiration. He steeped his fingers around his nose. Liz shook her head and rolled her eyes skyward. Oh, Sophie, she sighed again. Now we're on page 246. Decision time.